All right. Good evening, everybody. We are live. I have a message from my backstage telling me that we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to ProductTank London here on Monday, the 28th of February, 2022. My name is Magda Coutts, and I am one of the ProductTank organizers here in London, and I will be your host tonight. I'm really looking forward to introducing you to tonight's event and getting really stuck in, hearing from our speakers about remote working and how we as PMs can adapt our ways of working to benefit our product management craft. But first, few words from me about ProductTank and Mind the Product, the organization, the parent organization that ProductTank is part of. ProductTank is a global network of meetups that you'll find across the world. We are the world's largest product community that is run by product people for product people. Our beginnings were very humble. As the story goes, the first ProductTank was set up now, I can't even believe that it was 12 years ago, but it was 12 years ago. In a back room of a pub in Shoreditch here in London, bringing together a group of like-minded people who wanted to talk product. We have gone from those 25 people who showed up on that very first meetup in London to a network of over 150,000 members from all around the world. As you can see on the map, you'll see that we are active in over 200 cities across the world, across different continents, and I'm sure there are more popping up as we speak. And every time we meet up and we do another meetup, there's more places where you can find product talks, where you can find meetups, where you can discuss your practice and discuss your product management craft and practice. We pride ourselves on having an engaged and thriving community. So of course, it's really important that I share many ways of how you can get involved. You can speak at our ProductTank. There is many places where you can get involved. It's not just London, but we have lots of places around the UK, around the world. So if you have an interesting product story to share, a best practice case study, something that you think the whole community would benefit, please reach out and give us a shout. You could equally, if speaking perhaps is not your thing, but you still want to create a story and share a story about something that is really important in product management, you can host or sponsor a product tank. So you can weave 3 stories together, so how many stories depending on where you're going to be hosting your product tank, but you can shape how this product tank will look and work with speakers to deliver interesting and relevant content to our community. If speaking or hosting is not your thing, you can write. We are open to contributors from everywhere and around the world to contribute in articles on mindtheproduct.com. It's an amazing repository of knowledge and a place where many product managers turn to when they have a problem, when they are stuck. So it's an amazing place to contribute if you want to share your ideas with the rest of the community. And of course, you can become a Mind the Product member for even more content and being part of a global network of passionate product peers. Tonight, we will be hosting 3 talks, and at the end of the talks, we will also run a quick Q&A session. Pop any of your questions or comments using slido.com. Following this number, or you can pop your feedback or comments or questions in the comments section on this YouTube stream. We'll be monitoring this and then we'll ask your question at the end of the session to our speakers. So without much further ado, we are now going to get stuck in to the main event. Tonight, we will be talking about making product management work remotely. So using and discussing various of ideas of how we can harness this new ways of working to our advantage as product people. Looking to future and looking what the future holds as the regardless of the restrictions easing. I think the remote working or some kind of flavor of remote working is here to stay. So it's an interesting debate to take, and in kind of true fashion, I'm very pleased that we were actually able to host this meetup as a remote meetup opposed to face. That's probably going to be our last remote meetup. And we will be meeting in Conway Hall in March face to face. But I'm very pleased that we were able to host a round of talks about remote working in a remote setting. So we're going to kick off the event from a talk from Paul-Jervis Heath. Paul is a Chief Creative Officer at Modern Human. He is an award-winning product strategist and designer with almost 25 years of experience. As I said, he is the Chief Creative Officer and a founding partner of Modern Human. Modern Human is a multidisciplinary design practice and innovation consultancy. Paul will talk about the importance of developing asynchronous culture and what that really looks like. How that flows into daily life, into high-performing creative environment, and practically how this is going to be working in the hybrid future. So, with that introduction, I am going to hand over to Paul, who will spend the next 15-20 minutes talking to you. Over to you, Paul.
Brilliant, thanks, Magda. So I'll start by expanding a little on Magda's intro. I'm Paul-Jervis Heath, Chief Creative Officer at Modern Human. I have been a designer for 25 years. And in that time, I've designed just about everything from dashboards for autonomous vehicles, connected home appliances, artificial intelligence platforms that drive smart spaces, intelligent retail environments, software for hybrid classrooms. I work for Modern Human. We're a design practice and innovation consultancy. We design products, services, and experiences that empower and liberate ordinary people every day. So our work's created billions of pounds of revenue for our clients and led to more meaningful and sustainable human experiences. And my role at Modern Human is to lead our design practice. So our design research, product design, service design, and environment design capabilities all report into me. Modern Human is essentially the inspiration for my talk this evening, because everything that I'll tell you is sort of based on my own experience. So I'm hoping that will help you to make your efforts at product management work remotely more successful. Obviously, it is our experience and the experience of one organization. Hybrid working is different in every organization. Every organization's kind of developing its own kind of flavor and its own methods and practices. But the reason why I think Modern Human's a good place to start from for me is that we've always been a hybrid organization. So we've been going 10 years. Over the last 10 years, we've grown into an award-winning multidisciplinary design studio, and we work with clients like the BBC and Tesco and Arm and the United Nations and Cambridge University. So lots of organizations that you'd have heard of. It's how I know how to make design work remotely. During the pandemic, I watched an awful lot of creative directors who have much more of a platform than I do say that creativity and innovation can't happen remotely. Now, that's not true. In fact, it just exhibits a complete lack of imagination. And it's also an object lesson to us all. Just because you don't know how to do something, don't claim that it can't be done. When we created Modern Human, Chloe, the other founding partner, and I set out to reimagine the design practice, to try and create more value for our clients, to create a more creative environment for our team, and to contribute solutions that solve genuine problems in meaningful ways. So we took nothing for granted. We reimagined everything from first principles, from the way we worked to the way that we engaged with clients to the work that we took on. And one of the big differences that we didn't consider much actually back in 2012, but turned out to be a massive advantage during a global pandemic, was we always conceived of our practice to be a hybrid organization. And that we started from little things. So, for example, we don't send any internal email at Modern Human. None. Everything between us, between the team, goes over Slack, and it always has. We don't all sit in the same room. Our team's distributed and always has been. So our rituals and processes are designed for high levels of collaboration, but importantly, without the assumption that everyone is in the same place at the same time. And inverting this assumption had a really interesting impact on the way our studio worked, because it changed how we could work with clients. Instead of, we work with our clients, not for them. We bring them into the design process. We collaborate closely with them. And the same rituals and processes that enable us to work asynchronously across the boundaries of time and space also allowed us to work with our clients in the same way. It no longer mattered whether our clients were down the road or in another country. We could work with them equally collaboratively. And that in turn allowed us to work closer with our clients, actually, bringing them into the team, taking part in the design process. And of course, that stems from a core belief that we have at Modern Human, that we're all creative, emotional and social beings, that everyone is creative, emotionally intelligent and socially informed, and equally capable of making the leaps of insight and creativity that we make every day. And that has proved right on project after project. And where we've had problems, it wasn't the individuals at fault, it wasn't the team at fault, it was actually factors hidden within their organizational culture. And so what I thought I would share with you tonight is kind of 8 lessons from my experience of working in a hybrid capacity over the last 10 years and over 98 projects for clients. Let me add my slides back on and you'll be able to see some visual aids too. So the first lesson I think is meet at the lowest common denominator. There's always choices about how and where to hold a meeting. You know, and our choices are going to proliferate as we go back to the office, or as some people go back to the office. And so, you know, we've now got a choice of meeting all together, meeting all remotely, or meeting in some way in a mixed capacity, in a hybrid capacity. Now, what we've learned at Modern Human over the last 10 years is hybrid meetings where some people are in a room and some people are on a phone or a video call just don't work very well. You see, with a video call, there's always a slight delay, you know, so it's really difficult for someone who's on a video call to interject. It's really easy, actually, if you're in the room to interject. You look for that gap. You wait for someone to take a breath. You let your body language know that you want to interject, and you read their body language to understand when they're willing to let you interject. You don't get that with a video call. And we've all had that kind of experience while we've been fully remote of, you know, that slightly awkward thing where everybody kind of interrupts each other and it's difficult to work out, or you end up doing a round robin conversation where everybody has their chance to speak. And neither of those things flow when you've got some people in the room and some people outside the room. So what we've kind of agreed at Modern Human is that we'll always meet at the lowest common denominator. So if one person in a meeting is remote, the meeting takes place remotely, even if that means that everyone is sat somewhere together with their headphones on and talking into their computer, because that levels the playing field for everyone. And the only exception that we found works with that, and this is perhaps one for a product management setting, is stand-ups. So every day at 11 o'clock, we do a daily huddle. We get together, we talk about the work that's in the studio, and we tend to go around everyone to talk about what each person gets a chance to speak about what they're working on. And then we do kind of a QA and a kind of problems and blockers and things like that. And that session works fine if you've got some people in a room together and some people online. And it works because it's a round robin meeting already. It's got that kind of natural kind of flow to it anyway. And so it doesn't really limit people's ability to kind of interject or things like that. And so stand-ups actually don't work too badly in a mixed setting. But most other meetings just don't work when you've got some people online and some people and some people remote. The next thing that we've found is that actually our culture is stronger if we default to cameras on, or if we always have our cameras on by default. Now, I know this is going to be divisive because I know that's not people's kind of experience during the pandemic. But there's nothing worse than turning up as someone who goes into lots of different organizations. There's nothing worse than turning up to do a presentation or run a meeting and be faced with 20 little circles with initials in. It's so hard to present or have any form of collaboration when people don't turn their camera on. It's very difficult to get to know we've had people join during the pandemic, and I'm sure you do too, but we would actually know each other if we passed each other in the street. I've heard of teams in other organizations who actually, when they've met outside of lockdowns, it's the first time that they've actually seen each other's faces. Our bandwidth is good. Google Meet or Zoom work well. And having our cameras on means that we can see each other. We can see people's facial expressions. We get that little bit more feedback when we can see people talking, when we can see people's reactions when they're listening as well. And it feels like you get to know people. So between our team at Modern Human, we always kind of keep our cameras on. And you see reactions when you speak, and otherwise it's like talking into the void. We put our cameras on even when our clients don't. It's so ingrained and part of our culture that we end up putting our cameras on even if our clients all appear as kind of initialed circles. Partly it's about solidarity with the speaker. Actually, if one of my colleagues is presenting to a client, I actually want to support them. So turning my camera on, looking engaged, looking interested, looking like I agree with them is all kind of part of it. But I think something that goes along with having a cameras on culture is having a kind of permissive, open culture. So just the other day, I think it was Thursday last week, our director of outreach and engagement had done a workout during the day, and so she just got out the shower and she kept her camera off because she explained that was the case. It's important that people can explain why they don't have their camera on and kind of tell you what's good. Share the fact that actually it's okay to go to the gym in the middle of the day, and not be thought to be slacking off or whatever because you're not there. It creates this permissive culture where people have the permission to do other things during the day and not be chained to their desk when they're working remotely. And I understand the arguments for cameras off, and at the height of the pandemic, it was important maybe to give people the space to be able to turn their cameras off. But even then, I found it a really important indicator of how people were doing and where they were working and the setups that they got at home, so I could help people. So I'm a big believer in our cameras on kind of culture. Something that's really less obvious, I think, when you work remotely and work in a hybrid way as well, is working in the open. So I remember 15 years ago, I worked in a gloriously sunny studio between just behind Regent Street and Oxford Street, and there were these massive windows on 2 walls, beautiful kind of double aspect kind of place, great place to work. And I was head of design for a boutique digital agency, and designers sat in kind of rows, typical kind of open plan office in that way. But as designers would tell me that they hated being overlooked. They hated being overlooked because there was a danger that you would see something that I sat in the studio along with everyone else. I didn't want an office, and it made people feel uncomfortable because they were worried I could see over their shoulder across the studio, and it was because they didn't like showing work before they were happy with it. And I think that's a really natural instinct for people who are creative. You want to take work to a certain point before you share it with others. But this is where I learned the importance of working out in the open. On the other 2 walls of that studio, I had them set up with magnetic whiteboards. So, and I would take work and I would stick it up, and I would stick it out in the open where everybody could see it. And when we did crits, we would critique out in the open where everybody could see comments on the work and overhear comments on the work. And critiquing as a team meant that everybody learned from each other's work. It meant that it was really easy to bring in extra hands to a project because everybody was familiar with the work because it was all up on the walls already. Everybody felt ownership of the work that was going out, and the standard of the work started getting better because it had everyone's eyes on it. And as designers saw that change, they stopped being secretive. They understood that I understood and their colleagues understood that not finished was not finished. You know, it's really hard to get that ball rolling. You know, you feel like being naked, but it's for the good of the team. You know, that actually you create this situation in the team where where the team is in it for them and they are in it for each other. And it reminded me of the Rudyard Kipling quote, which I love. You know, the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. And I think that's kind of really important in a design team, and that translates to remote and hybrid working. You know, I think it's really important to work out in the open from the very beginning, from when you first start work on something, whether it's new, whether it's an iteration of something. Actually, make sure your work is in a shared drive. Make sure it's in a place where everybody can access it. Design applications like Figma really help with that. You know, if you're working in a shared space, that really helps with working out in the open. And everybody being able to see the works going on. We found this was really important during the pandemic as a risk mitigation. It meant that if anybody did get sick, and we were lucky that no one did until very recently, that actually we knew where the work was, and somebody else could take that on, and people didn't feel like they had to work when they were sick and all of those kind of things. But I would say, you know, make sure your work is in shared drives and in Slack, and making sure that crits happen openly. It's really easy to lose sight of work in a hybrid team and assume that people are talking about the work where you can't see them. And I think that's really important. It links to my next point, and that's a hybrid team needs a single open source of the truth. Have a think about for a second where people go to find out anything in your company. Because if they have to ask each other, you have a problem. And this is what we found at the beginning of the pandemic. A lot of the people that we work with outside of Modern Human had real problems making decisions and finding information. And that's because they didn't have information out in the open. You know, so if people have to ask each other, then you have to know who to ask. And that used to be really easy when you could walk around the office, ask a colleague, the colleague could say, oh, I don't know, but so-and-so will know over there. They sit on that desk at the end of that row, and you could just wander over there and you could ask them and go, no, I haven't got that, but so-and-so was saying that they'd seen it. And you could kind of find information just by wandering around the office. In a hybrid environment, that doesn't work because the people that you're looking for might not be there that day. And in a remote environment, it doesn't work at all. And so, you know, any member of the team should be able to lay their hands on anything that they need, you know, whether that's the latest product strategy, the latest customer research, the latest results of the usability testing you did last week, the quarterly company results, the chief product officer's OKRs or the chief technical officer's OKRs, anything, literally. And I think the problem that we've got that works against this is that in large companies, information is power. You get these information fiefdoms set up. And when I've been doing ethnography and organizational cultures, I've actually been told, you know, I have that information, but I don't just want anybody to be able to find it. I want them to come and ask me for it, because that way I know who's got it. I know who's seen it. I can do a voiceover to it and tell them what to think about it before I give it to them. The problem is these information fiefdoms are toxic to hybrid productivity. You can't wander around the office asking people if they know about something. You know, you just need the latest customer research. You just need the results of that latest usability test. You just need the be able to find all of these kind of things, and you won't find it unless it's in a single open source of the truth. And that's why I think this is really important from a knowledge management point of view. Have a think about how much time you spend in meetings. How much time does your company spend in meetings? I know several very large organizations where people have no time to get the work done because they spend all of their time in meetings. You know, they have a whole strata in their organization whose job is meetings. Maybe before the pandemic, it was spreadsheets. Now it's meetings. I think every organization, to be efficient in a hybrid sense, needs to work out how to kill the meetings, you know, unless the purpose is people-based. And the thing I see is statusing. The time that organizations waste statusing, you know, telling other people what the status of things is, you know, that's dead time. The point about the open source of the truth is if you want to know the status of something, you can go and look in that single open source of the truth, you know, and you find it there. You don't need to be told that all the projects are on track or all the projects are on track, but this one's amber, you know, whatever it is. Statusing has to be kind of cut out if you want to be efficient in a hybrid sense. The only meetings to attend is those where the output of the group is greater than the sum of its parts. The reason for meetings is getting together to solve problems, getting together to identify problems, getting together to generate ideas, getting together to decide direction. Never get together to share status. Share status asynchronously. Post your update in your single source of open truth and never report it synchronously again. Synchronous reporting of statusing is the biggest waste of time that you see organizations kind of do. My sixth point is never compromise the culture to fit in. You know, actually create a hybrid working culture and assimilate other people into it. You know, include other people into it, but never compromise on the culture. We work with organizations much bigger than ours. We work with all types of different organizations, technical organizations, creative organizations, you know, very innovative organizations, less innovative organizations, and all of our clients have very different cultures to ours, you know. But the thing is we don't compromise on our hybrid culture when we meet theirs, for example, in workshops and meetings and things like that. So I mentioned I've talked already about, you know, always having our cameras on. When we turn up to client meetings, sometimes we're the only people in the meeting with our cameras on. But we don't compromise by turning our cameras off. That's fitting in with their culture. Instead, we know that actually when we've got our cameras on, we're supporting the person talking. And so we keep our cameras on. And I think that's really important. You know, there are lots of ways where actually we always stick to those things that we know work, even when we lean into bigger organizations and they behave differently to how we work. And I think that's really important, whether you're a team or whether you're a small organization, you know, whether you're the product team, whether you're a kind of functional team within a unit, having a functional hybrid culture, having a functional asynchronous culture, and sticking to that even when you come across people who don't work in that same culture is really important. Because when you compromise it, what you find is that the little compromises lead to bigger compromises, and before you know it, you've lost the things that you thought were kind of important. My seventh kind of lesson that I've learned in seeing hybrid working for 10 years is simple but important, and that's know your tools. You know how to share a presentation in both the tools that you use and the tools that your clients or your partners use as well. And make sure you can pull it off. You know, if you use Miro or a collaborative whiteboarding piece of software, know how to use the timer function and the voting function and things like that. I remember the days, you know, I'm sure we all remember the days when people would spend 5 to 10 minutes at the start of every meeting faffing with a projector, you know, because they couldn't get the projector to work. Unacceptable. You know, actually, you should be able to kind of, I pride myself on being able to walk into any meeting room in any country and being able to get the projector up and running within 60 seconds. It's a pointless life skill to have, I suppose. But the point is you know, it's always the same things that go wrong. You fix one, you fix them all. And so, you know, being able to get it to work just allows you to actually get on with the meeting without all the apologizing and undermining, you know, kind of things at the beginning of the meeting. And actually, you're much more in control now than that projector that you used to turn up to, where you didn't know what type of projector it was, you didn't know what lead it would need and all of that kind of stuff. You probably know that you're using, you know, Zoom or Teams or whatever it is. Get to know it, get really good at kind of at using it, and all of the kind of collaborative features of it as well. Having said that, we've all had the mute moment, you know, where we've forgotten to unmute when we started speaking. It happens, you know, but be forgiving and sympathetic, obviously, but everyone has to know the tools. And actually share stories from using new tools amongst the team. Create space in the team to actually talk about the way you're using particular tools and how you do certain things, and step through how you use some of the more advanced features of the tools. Because knowing that you can create a waiting room at the beginning of a Zoom call, knowing that you can make people come in on mute, you know, they're all useful things to know. Know how the advanced features work. Create templates as well, so that you don't have to invent everything from scratch. Yeah, just kind of get to know your tools. It just makes collaboration so much easier. And I think whereas that was kind of a small lesson that we've learned, the next one's quite a big one. At Modern Human, we fundamentally believe that a diverse team is a competitive advantage. So diversity is one of our hiring criteria. So we always hire we consider diversity as one of the key things that we're hiring for. So, you know, after all of the kind of skills thing, then diversity is one thing that we will select for. And our definition of diversity includes acquired diversity as well as inherent diversity. And we've taken a decision that diversity is more important than cultural fit. You know, that actually there's an awful lot of excuses that hide behind people not being a cultural fit in an organization. And we've taken a decision that actually it's more important to have people who don't fit in to a culture than it is to have people who do easily fit into a culture. The problem when you hire for cultural fit is everyone starts looking the same and everyone starts thinking the same. And actually, when you're a creative organization, what's valuable is people who think differently. And so those people are not necessarily going to be the greatest cultural fit when you interview them. They're not going to be the greatest cultural fit when you first hire them. But having a culture that is expansive and includes those people and fits them into a way of working is one of the things that we've learned actually improves diversity within the team, keeps people in the workforce for when normally they might leave, and it's been really advantageous to us over the last 10 years. And I heard someone who works for a large organization the other day voice the concern that actually remote working could create echo chambers, because we all live around people who are probably a bit like us. You probably live on a street with houses that are similar to yours. You might notice that your neighbors drive similar cars to your car. That we tend to automatically kind of move towards people who are similar to us. And actually, if we're not thrown into an office together, that creates a bit of a cultural echo chamber. And that could be a problem for diversity and inclusion and other factors. So I think it's really important to continue promoting diversity, and our policy of hiring for diversity is one of the things that I think is most important when we think about what's created our culture and what's created our resilience to the pandemic, and what's enabled us actually to work in a hybrid way for so long as well. And so I think that's the kind of final lesson I would leave you with. No great conclusion. I just wanted to share some kind of lessons of working remotely for the last 10 years. So I hope that's been useful, and I look forward to your questions at the end. Thank you very much.
I've got to give you a little round of applause. If we were having if we had, obviously, if this was a live event, there would be a crowd clapping. So I'm just gonna try to do something. Thank you very much, Paul. A lot of really interesting takeaways and a lot of ideas that you can immediately kind of take in practice. I mean, there was a lot of pointers that stood out, but I think the one that really tickled me, obviously, was always camera on, and your story around the gym and stuff. That's quite an interesting one, because I can imagine some people having having a challenge in terms of mindset shift and so on. But the really important one for me, and I guess we'll debate this later in the Q&A, is they were all very fantastic pieces of learning, but work in the open is a good one, because I think we as product managers, we might be sometimes trying to do so much and practice so well, and being vulnerable and kind of show that this is not finished yet, but showing where your blind spots are is something that I'm certainly working on, trying to be more open. So that's a really interesting takeaway. But anyway, we can dive deeper and follow up with more questions at the end. Thank you very much, Paul. Now on to our second speaker. Our second speaker joins us from Lisbon. Thank you for the remote. Thanks to obviously remote setting. João Craveiro is a product manager for working at remote. He has been working in software engineering and held product and leadership roles for many years. I think he's been, working in software engineering for over 10 years, and held product and leadership roles for the past 7 years. Worked with companies such as Premium Minds, Onfido, Farfetch, and now Remote. He also held teaching positions at the University of Lisbon. and the Universidade Lusófona. He specializes in B2B and platform products. He has done product discovery and delivery from products in multiple industries. So João will talk about the flavors of remote work and again share his top tips, because I'm sure we've got lots more that you could share with us on doing better PM work, kind of drawn from his wide-ranging experiences of remote work. So over to you, João.
Thank you, Magda. Hi, everyone, wherever you are when you're joining us and listening to this. And yeah, that's, as Magda said, what I'm expecting to do here is to share some learnings. And again, remote work is full of nuance, full of advice. We saw a great rundown from Paul with many tips. And so I thought, okay, what am I going to do? And so I picked to share 3 of the things I've learned. And again, there would be so much to share. So I picked 3 lessons from doing product management across flavors of remote work. And that goes from office-first companies, either local or global, remote-first companies, so companies who do still have offices, but do, like Paul shared, for instance, meeting at the lowest common denominator and really doing that thing where if one is remote, then everyone becomes remote. The remote forced, which is of course a special flavor of remote work where we all had to do the best we could due to the pandemic. And then, of course, full remote, where it's a deliberate practice where all the company is working remotely. And the common thing about across these remote work flavors is, of course, people, because we always work with people. And there are 2 main pillars related to people, which are common to companies in all these flavors that I've mentioned. And this somewhat goes into something that Paul also mentioned, which is you have people who are not where you are. Even for an office-first company, you have customers outside the office who will not always be with you, and you won't be always able to meet them physically. You have colleagues in other offices, and if you're in a global company. And then when you start moving into more remote first practices, you have people who can be working from home, either sometimes or all the time. You have your colleagues from sales who might be on the road a lot, and so are usually remote from the rest of the company, even if they're office-based. And you have vendors and partners, a lot of people that you collaborate with who are not always where you are. And then there's also people who are not when you are. And again, this is something that will exist in any company. It doesn't have to be a full remote company. If it's a global company, you'll have people who belong to different offices with different time zones. You'll have people who will be on holidays, on leave. And last but not least, you will have the most remote of all the employees, the one who has already left. And that's not one to ignore when it comes to some of the remote work practices. So this to say that the pillars of what we now call remote work have been there for a while. We even had a discussion at Product Camp London 3 years ago, so before all this drive and all this big change that the pandemic brought in terms of working remotely. And we were talking about distributed teams with people who worked in offices, with people in other offices, and everything was already there. So that's the first lesson, I would say, to share from working and discussing in all these environments, is that what we now call remote work is actually all around us and always was, even if we're not working remotely. Remote work and all that it entails is everywhere, as soon as there's some kind of distribution, or even just because you have customers and partners outside the office. So this means that all remote work practices can apply. And here I simplified it with 3 pillars, but again, it's always hard to list practices because they're not isolated from each other. Working asynchronously and documented are kind of two halves of the same orange. Text over slides, and then all the many other practices that are preached and that work for global companies and for hybrid companies. like Paul shared, like we at Remote, we also share transparently and publicly how we work in a fully global, fully distributed company. GitLab also shares. So there is a lot of practices, and all of them can apply to any of these flavors of remote work. That being said, not all of them will work everywhere, every time, or with everyone. And especially as a product manager, you will have to work with different teams, with different functions, with different collaborators inside and outside the company, different cultures. And so, of course, not all of these things that we've discussed here and that we keep discussing about working remotely, not everything will work everywhere, every time, or with everyone. And that segues to my second piece of advice learned from doing product management across these environments is to not try to change it all at once. And so this is hard, especially because as product managers, we often like to think of ourselves as change agents, but even change needs to be managed. And so that's my advice, is to not try to change it all at once, especially if you land in a company that might not be as mature working remotely as you are, or which doesn't historically have the culture of remote working that you're used to, or that you're expecting, or that you're trying to promote. Just trying to work in a completely different way just because there's full, solid, and tried and true advice that that's how you work remotely might not work well. And so my advice would be to read the room, understand how the different people are used to work, prefer to work, what kind of things will bring the most benefit earliest. Basically, read the room and start small. So pick something. And again, I mentioned that not all of those things work everywhere, with everyone, and with every time. So pick one of these. Pick one place to start. Pick one group of people to start, or pick one particular activity or ceremony to start doing something differently. And again, as we saw, Paul had 8 pieces of advice. There's plenty of advice. So what could be the one thing to start? That, of course, depends a lot. You read the room. Every room will be different. But even across multiple rooms, one thing that I found that works well everywhere, and that is easy to start small and autonomously, even when it goes slightly against the grain of the wider organization's culture, is documenting things. And I'll now explain a little bit what I mean with documenting. It's not necessarily documents. So I'm splitting the notion of documenting from the notion of, for instance, reasoning and sharing mostly around documents or text versus images or slide decks. I'm not talking about that part, but mostly around documenting, about things being registered and available to everyone. After a sip of water. And so one way of introducing documenting practices, not necessarily, or not at first in the whole organization, but at first in your vicinity, is how you handle questions. And as product managers, we do tend to get a lot of them. And so the main practice that you can try, and of course your mileage may vary, but from my experience, this tended to be something that works everywhere and that you can kind of introduce into an organization, is when someone asks you a question, and we're talking about here, of course, written means like email, Slack, Teams, whatever you use internally for chat. If you have a link to documentation, a link to a reference that you can use as an answer to that question, just do it. Of course, be polite, pad a little bit, not just sending the link dryly to the other side. That's not the idea. But basically focus your answer on referring the person to the documentation. And then, of course, there's a missing branch here, which is, okay, what if you don't have a link? If you don't have a link, make it so that you have one. Create documentation on the spot and respond with that documentation instead of answering the question. so that you don't keep answering the same question time and time again. And then documentation becomes accessible, not just for when you need to answer the same question, but ideally so that people can refer to that documentation and find it first when they're seeking whatever is being answered there. For this to work, there's one thing that definitely is needed, which is to make documentation the path of least resistance. And there's two sides to this: is making documentation super easy to access and super easy to update. And why is this important? Which will I start first? Yeah, maybe easy to access. And what does this mean? If you have this practice of answering with links, but then you keep facing, oh, this link is not accessible, you have to share it with a certain person, you answer, oh yeah, thank you for the answer, but I cannot open that link, etc. That's not going to work well. And also, ideally, what you want to is to progress in a way that the documentation starts becoming the source of truth and the first go-to place for knowledge. And so it needs to be easy to access, easy to search, so that for someone who is seeking information and seeking knowledge, it's as easy as asking on Slack. I usually quip that in a lot of companies, wikis are the place where half the company diligently puts information that the other half won't bother searching before asking on Slack. But that's usually down to getting that information from documentation, from wiki, whatever it is, not being as easy. So you need to make that super easy, super frictionless. And then updating, because of course you also don't want to, this process of having a question on a somewhat, I wouldn't say instantaneous, but Slack does create some degree of interactivity on expectation of answers in some cultures, of course. And of course, doing this trick where you always answer with documentation, and when you don't have it, you create it to be able to answer with documentation. If updating the documentation is hard, if you need to go ask someone else to update the documentation, or if you need to go fetch a source file from a presentation because that's the documentation, all of that just kind of jeopardizes this approach. So summary, documentation, both getting it and updating it being the path of least resistance. And then what usually happens, and what in my experience happens, is that this is a practice that can spread somewhat surreptitiously because the benefits start showing. And what are the benefits of documenting things is, again, going back to what we mentioned, is being able to exchange information transparently and equitably, regardless of whether people are where you are or not. Also, accessing information efficiently and effectively, regardless of whether people are where you are when you are. And I mentioned that the most remote employee is the one that's no longer there. That's another benefit, is that if you bring documenting into the day-to-day practices, you're not, when someone leaves the organization, you're not reliant on their ability to properly document what they know, what they have in their heads, what the context that they have documented well when they leave. Basically, every documentation, every piece of information remains and is organized within the organization. And then when you need something that someone used to know, that information is probably also captured within the organization, even after the person has left. And also just the interactivity, the responsiveness, because when this happens, people start realizing that they can rely on documentation. Documentation is always there. So when they have a question, they don't need to be waiting for someone else to be online, waiting for someone else to come back from holidays, whatever. They can just rely on documentation, be more efficient, more autonomous, and not be blocked. And so the benefits start showing. And then the next step is being able to sow the seeds and start then growing other practices. Because then what happens is that when documentation shows that you can work effectively and you can unblock things even when people are not when you are and not where you are, then you start having the terrain to grow other benefits of working remotely, like starting to not care so much about whether people are in the office or not caring so much whether people are in the office at 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. straight or have more flexible schedules. So that's why, from experience, I saw that documenting things is a good, let's say, Trojan horse to other remote working practices. So recapping the 3 of the many things I've learned. So the ones I picked to share from my experience doing products across multiple remote work flavors. The first was that remote work actually is all around us and always was, even when we were not working remotely. The second is that, of course, there are different cultures, different people, different contexts. And as product managers, we need to do a bit of a balance between being change agents, but also fitting in and working well with people with completely different needs, experiences, cultures, etc. And so not trying to change it all at once. And then the third thing is that when trying to change something at first, that documenting things and embedding documentation practices in your day-to-day with others tends to be a good first thing that works with others, and that can start then growing in the organization and sowing the seeds for other benefits from working remotely. And that's what I had to share today. I hope it was useful.
Thank you. It was super useful. And I think the common thread between your presentation and Paul's presentation is obviously there are different types of remote work, and remote working of some kind, and some elements of remote work have been with us for ages. It's not a new thing. And obviously, as we move into the new stage of the hybrid work, where some of us will be fully remote, but a lot of us will now be moving into this hybrid reality where most of the time we'll be remotely working, but maybe with an occasional visit. It's quite an interesting idea that the practices that you've adopted are practices that we can all adopt. And what stood out for me from your presentation, obviously all of it was really useful, but the documentation being the path of least resistance is really really interesting. And making it easy and accessible, and like you said, keeping it updated, because I think a lot of companies will struggle with this. This is a very simple principle, but even I've seen in my organization that's something that is an internal challenge. So it's a very interesting one, like focusing on that tiny little, well, not tiny, it's but anyway, very, very interesting. We've got a bunch of questions obviously that we'll go through in the Q&A. So for now, again, thank you very much, and I'll see you at the Q&A in a little bit. Thank you. Thank you, João. Right, so our final speaker joining us on our virtual stage is Inês Liberato. She is the product coach at the Founders Factory, and she has product experience across many industries, and I'll let her introduce her properly when she does her talk. She's worked in variety industries and managed products at different stages of the development, and worked with both in-house and offshore teams. Her favorite challenges involve setting up things up from scratch and experimenting. In her talk, Inês will be covering her experience of being a product leader within remote and synchronous scenarios. She'll go through the importance of establishing ground rules and setting context while keeping things human. So I will now invite Inês onto our stage. Over to you, and I'll see you in a little bit. Thank you.
Okay. Don't take long. Come back fast. Hi, my name is Inês, and I'll be talking with you about leadership and product in remote contexts. So like Magda was saying, my product experience has been quite diverse. Just some of the industries and companies that I've worked in the past. So you'll see here anything from B2C to B2B and anything in between. And industries such as affiliate marketing, big data, IoT, gambling, regulation technology, and most recently at Founders Factory, I'm a product coach. And Founders Factory is an organization that helps founders go further faster. I'm working in a studio that is goes across the accelerator and the venture stage of an organization. So my remote experience has been quite diverse as well, but you can see that I've never been fully remote in an async situation. And I liked João's expression around forced remote. That was my fully remote experience. But I've never been completely and 100% in person. I've always had the pleasure to work with many other teams, not necessarily just a team in the office. And then mostly been potentially project teams, but not always. So design team, development team, sometimes they're outsourced and you need to be able to work with them and bring them to the organizational culture that you have in place. However, I do have a slight unfair advantage in the sense that I'm not from the UK. I'm Portuguese and I've been here for 8 years and a half. And so I do have some experience about creating meaningful relationships and maintaining them while being online. For example, João and I know each other from a community that we are common at, and we never met in person, even though we were from pretty much very close to each other. So how did I turn this unfair advantage into my own benefit? Like a good product manager, I like breaking things down. Product management is like ogres who are like onions and they have layers. So we'll go through a couple of the main layers of how to do this. We need to look at the organization side, the team, and yourself. So starting with the organization, how do you understand an organization? How do you explore an organization? You're new, you're a leader. How do you get things going? But also, how, even if you're not necessarily a person in leadership, how do you make things work? So even though the main conversation today is around the leadership piece, but I try to make things in a more medium term, medium rare kind of service, and look at things like something that you can do as well, even if you're not necessarily a leader. So for me, understanding the organization comes down to 4 parts. You start with the business side of things and understand the context of the business. So whenever we say, oh, it depends, these might be some of the things that it might be dependent on. So the type of industry, the actors in that industry. So actors, I mean your customers, your clients, your buyers, your managers, your users, and everything in between. In a B2B from a B2C type of context, how do they make money? So all of those questions are helpful to set up your learning process. Then you have the people side. So if you have a team, how does your team like? If you're in a team, how does your team like? And how, where does that team fit in the rest of the organization? So is product an active participant in the organization, or maybe something that is on the side and is more of the project type of approach? We've all been there. Who does what, but more importantly, who are the key masters and the gatekeepers? So who are going to be the people who are going to open doors for you and help you and facilitate? Everyone has in their organization that person who knows everyone and knows everything. Find those people. They're going to help you. But at the same time, you also have the people who be like, I need to have every single detail about what you're going to do at all times, otherwise nothing gets done. Those people happen as well. On a third angle, we then have to consider the cycles. So when does your organization set up goals? What are those goals dependent on? Where does it start and where do they finish? So for example, do they start at the point where a goal is set and then they finish when something is released? Or do they finish when you get insights from it? So you need to understand that to work your magic. And then finally, the systems. So the underlying bits that you might not necessarily have access to, but you might have to use your product acumen to figure that out. So how do people describe your organization when you talk with them? Are they saying it's chaotic? For me, even when people say chaotic, there's always a pattern. There's always things that happen at certain points in time. So keep an eye for those. Are things tracked and recorded? Is there any documentation at all? I've been in organizations, zero documentation. How transparent is this? Are there any feedback loops? So it's all sets of questions. There are examples of set of questions that you can ask when you are exploring and trying to break an organization down, and how does it impact your work? How do you do this remotely? Well, I have one secret sauce to this, is define your set of hypotheses and ship something. And this can be as simple as if you're working a platform team, if you're mostly a product manager of internal products, shipping something means something, working with a lot of different departments across the organization and getting something done, getting something live. Because until you get something live, people might tell you a lot about the organization and you might hear a lot of opinions about the organization, but you haven't seen those cogs moving. You don't know exactly what things might come up. But also in a remote context, you have no other choice, and those people will have no other choice than to pop up their heads and go, oh, why are you doing this? And you go, haha, found you, you're there. So when you actually put something in practice, people will be able to come and meet you, but also be able to find those people and identify those underlying systems and everything else. So that's the organization piece. Starting to look at your team. So more on a management side of things, which is normally a very heavy load for people who are managers, product or otherwise. The secret or the best thing where I spent most of my time with teams is getting to know people at an individual level. And so that means understanding their motivations. And at this point, I think it's very important to say their needs are also part of how they get motivated. For example, when we were all working remotely over these past 2 years, and knowing what people's contexts was really important to me. Because, for example, as we start having conversations about going back to the office and things like that, a lot of people might not be comfortable with that because they might still have friends and family members who are not well. They still might have family, friends, or themselves who need to protect themselves. And so we still need to make sure that we have the foundations in place and those needs. And, at this point in time, talking about motivation, you can think about, from the top of my mind, I can think about 20 different motivation theories, but Maslow's pyramid is also how to identify what motivates people. And the basic, if the foundations are not there, people don't feel safe, they will not be able to move forward and do anything else, not think about who they are today or where they want to be. So you need to understand what is the context so you can work with that, right? And try to make the best out of the situation. Then you have the practice aspect. So what they want to be and who they want to be and how they do things is also very important because it's part of our job, right? Doing things in a way that makes sense, that follows certain practices and principles. And finally, the assessment piece. So setting up those goals and those success metrics and thinking about that reward system that needs to be linked to that motivation piece. So in bit more detail at doing this in a remote piece, for example, and something that worked really well for me in the past was taking an example of Petra's Strong Product People book, where she outlines the main identifiers of a good product manager. So translating that to the organization, and for example, give people time and the space to think about how they rate themselves. You can, for example, it doesn't need to be a one-to-one conversation to begin with, but you can, for example, set up a form on Google Docs, on Google Forms or Microsoft, whatever tool you're using, and create almost like it's a user questionnaire or survey, right? And give them time to think and make their own analysis. And you do the same, right? If you give the team a form to fill in and a template to follow, to rate themselves and talk a little bit more about themselves, you will do the same thing. And then you can follow up with the chat and understand, where do you guys meet? Where do you differ? That's been really, really helpful, because it's the same base for everyone, but then the outputs and the results of these conversations will lead you to very different places. On a practice side, I'll need to be very careful introducing this, but in a remote setting is a little bit challenging sometimes to know how someone works because you don't see them working, right? We were talking about being in the office, not being in the office, but if product management is a craft that needs to be coached, if I'm not seeing my player and know how they're tackling the next player, I don't know if it was a good tackle or not, right? So this is why I phrase this in discussing what makes people comfortable in this setting, because for some people it might be, yeah, Inês, you can totally come into my meeting and help me and see me how I facilitate people or facilitate that meeting. Or yes, just I'll record my user session and you can watch it after. Or, yeah, totally okay with you asking some feedback from the people I had in the meeting, or that presentation I end up running or recording for the rest of the organization. And so this is, I'm not saying that this will be something that will be the same across your work with that team, but it's important to set the principles and the practices, but your expectations as well, right? So the team's principles is how you start setting up a good product culture. And also it helps the next stage on the assessment piece, because sometimes it's not just about great goal achievement or you exceeded expectations in achieving this goal, is more than your SMART goals. Sometimes it's about you following the company's values, right? I've been at Founders Factory, for example. We have a channel set by wonderful people's team where you just give kudos, but the kudos are given in the context of the company's cultures. So someone was great and represented this company culture at this excellent level. That's a great idea for you as well, in the sense of not just negative feedback. You can also have a lot of very good positive feedback. That's great. Again, linking to that motivation piece. Some people love that. And then, but also on the negative side, so maybe not have a public channel for that. But on your assessment is like, yeah, you're great at achieving your goals, but you didn't deal with that situation very well. And that leads me to my last point. Careful how you give feedback as well, because I think that you should give feedback early. Don't wait until your quarterly review or your 360 review. If something is going very well, people need to know what they're doing well so they can continue doing. But at the same time, if something is not done well, let's say that you didn't respect your colleague when in that meeting, that goes against that principle that we always open up the conversation, for example. Or you didn't achieve the goal, and the problem is not necessarily they didn't achieve the goal, but it's more that we didn't have the conversations in place when you told me that you wouldn't be able to achieve that goal. So having those principles in place, having that culture in place is very helpful, because it will help you as well in that assessment piece. On the day-to-day, here are a couple of things that worked well. Quick kind of thing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You'll have the slides, so you can spend some time looking at this. But things that work well, Interesting point about Paul, the cameras on and off situation. I've worked thinking about that diversity angle as well. There were a lot of people who, because everything was closed and everything was, people were just not well, they didn't feel comfortable having cameras on. And so had a conversation with me, totally fine. Sometimes it would be challenged in external meetings, and I'd make sure to make everyone clear that this person in our team, this is how we run things, and so it should be fine for everyone else. Plus, it's always good to make use of the technology that you have behind you. You have raise hands technology across pretty much all video tools. And so, for example, you should have seen my first alignment session, where I would probably have a little bit of a military operation because people were just not used to work remote. It was a whole organization where they were not used to work remote. And so people were talking over each other, like Paul was saying earlier. And so I had, you can only speak and I'll cut you off. I have a mute capability. And so I'll cut you off if you speak over someone else. And times were kept, people raised their hands, and we had a very smooth meeting. Again, you don't need to do this all the time, but sometimes if people are not used to things, you might need to set clear rules. So, like I was saying, breaking long meetings across a few days, give people time to think as well is useful. João was saying, keep every resources in one place, be intentionally creative. So sometimes you don't need to be a meeting. Sometimes it can be a forum, sometimes an email. A meeting can be a Google Doc that people can add comments to, set up the time when you want to be ready to work with those comments. Rename your one-to-ones, because sometimes it's the one break that people have in the day where they can be a little bit more relaxed. So for example, I had meeting names that were chatty brain time with Alex, for example. Being that one-to-one, we would talk about a lot of things and potentially work. So you define those conversations, how you want to lead those conversations, but you can set the tone with the title of the meeting. Remote donuts. So stores are not closed anymore. You can definitely try and scavenge for some budget to send some remote donuts to people, team members, for happy reasons and sometimes less happy reasons. It's like a hug at every bite. We would have meetings that at the end of the week chat just with the team, and we would describe our week and how it was an animal. Sometimes there was lasagna as well. Ask me about it. I'll give you more comments after this. Drive the culture and lead by example. I think that this is something that was really strong. So in that cameras off situation, or cameras on, you do you. But if that was something that they had agreed with me, I'd make sure that everyone at that meeting or in that conversation, they would know that was something that they had agreed with me, and that was not really a point of conversation. But at the same time, if I'm not feeling super fantastic and fabulous that day, speaking with the team and being honest with the team really helped with them being honest with me too, right? You're not this fortress, you're a person as well, and being honest about how you feel and your energy is really important. We'll get to that in a bit. Always be adjusting. So all these, the cadence of meetings, how often you speak with people, those stand-ups, for example, we got to a point where we didn't have daily stand-ups. We would probably have a stand-up every other day, then give some comments over chat on the other days, and probably reserve 2 days in the week or 3 days in the week, depending on the work that we were doing in the calendar, and said open door time. So the team would be able to prepare any kind of things that we wanted to chat about. And this was to make sure that everyone knew when the communal meetings would happen. But we found this sweet spot after adjusting, after a few months of testing and trying what worked well for the team and for that theme, that initiative that we had in place. Does it need to be a meeting? Things don't necessarily need to be a meeting. Now, day-to-day with the organization. So we talked about the organization, knowing the organization. How does this impact your team? So you can also test different approaches with the organization. Do road shows with case studies. So you will still be talking with customers. You'll still be interviewing people, doing surveys, doing your testing. How are you communicating that to the organization? Have everything in a single place, but sometimes you need a little bit extra thing. And sometimes it is a conversation with the one team or one team lead, and that makes a total difference. Get your customers involved as well. And you sometimes need to be honest and coach the organization that we don't have all the answers, and that is fine. Let them come to have a discovery session. That motivated a lot of other people, scared a lot of people too. You're never sure what the designer or the developer will have to say, but that creates bonding, especially sometimes in a B2B type of setting. It creates that extra amount of bonding that you might need with that customer. Making the work visible. So where's your roadmap? Make sure that is visible. People can comment, people can add things, and you can answer back and say, this is not now. And give space for feedback, because like I was saying, sometimes people need the time to think. Going back to that motivation speak, what do you need? I need time to think. Give them time to think. And that goes across your team. It also counts with the organization. Some people are just tired. Some people like thinking outside of working times. And manage their time differently. And then rinse and repeat. A lot about this is about consistency and always increasing the value that you're giving. Finally, what about yourself? So this all felt very overwhelming. Managing all these emotions and expectations and setting goals and preparing meetings and being meaningful in making sure that you're intentional. So I was saying a few weeks ago on Twitter that you need to prioritize and defend your calendar in the same fierceness that you prioritize your roadmap. Why is other people's times more important and relevant than yours? So you need to be clear about it at the same time, and be transparent. So when you have your focus time, what do you really use it for? Do you use it for replying to emails? Call it reply to emails. And then people will know that, and you yourself, be able to check yourself for that. More importantly, also check your energy. So sometimes you just start the week really tired. When is it going to be your free slot that week? Do you have free slots? Maybe you need to start canceling stuff. I know that sometimes it's hard, but prioritize your time. But don't do it alone, right? This is hard. It's you checking for those things will create more work for yourself, right? So tap into that energy that the HR team or the people team will have. HR stands for human relationships. So who best than the people who studied human relationships to help you? There are synergies that you can create across teams. So how many teams are you managing and leading? So can they feed on each other to power up? And, maybe you can be a little bit more removed and think about that strategy, that vision, and etc. So other managers, let's say for argument's sake, you don't have an HR team because your team is just too small. Other managers have to manage people too. What are they doing in their meetings? What are their rituals? Can you chat? Can you set up your own cohort manager group in your organization? But also don't forget to raise it to the leadership team, right? Maybe you need help. Maybe you need help with communicating that you need help, Does the organization have mental awareness, has any mental awareness to people not being well, right? Do they have the systems in place? That is important. But ultimately, also reach out to the community. A lot of this past 2 years, especially, and over 7 years that I've been in product, I've always got a lot of power and a lot of value from the community. Chat with other product people. What do they need? What are they saying? So as a summary, as just last thoughts, don't forget to get a clear understanding of your organization via practice. Don't just lead on what people are saying. Your team is your responsibility. And they're formed with people. Get to know those individuals, understand what motivates them. understand what you can control, because sometimes if someone is not well, you can't necessarily control that. And so maybe the best help that you can give is to say, go and help find support somewhere else, or in this place, there's a lot of, nowadays there's a lot of agencies that for free can help people and to better understand themselves. Be intentional with each relationship. And this can be as simple as making sure that you have an agenda in your meeting calendar. So that is very important. Help people set up expectations, know that you can count on you, but also respect your needs. Don't forget about yourself. If you're not well, you cannot be well for anybody else. Thank you very much. I hope that this wasn't too much. And if you have any questions, I think QA comes next.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Inês. That was super useful. Again, round of applause. And you leave us with more ideas and things that we can implement. I definitely want to dig into some of the examples that you've given us at Q&A in a moment. I would say what stood out with me, there was obviously a bunch of things, but feedback on practice and feedback early before you kind of reflected, that's a really interesting one to take away and implement. And then consistency as a product leader, and looking after yourself as well. That's quite important. And I think we tend to forget about these things in the midst of other things that we're trying to prioritize and manage. So it's really interesting. It's really interesting stuff. Thank you very much for sharing. So again, round of applause. And then I think I'm going to get all of the speakers to join us on our virtual stage. We've had a bunch of questions on Slido, which is great. There is, and I obviously we have a bunch of other questions. So I think I'll start maybe with we had a few. We had, like I said, a bunch of questions on Slido, and we had people voting on them. So I'm just going to go and try to get through with them as quickly as possible, because we have about 15 minutes, give or take, before we break. So let's start with the first one. This one is directed to Paul, but guys, feel free to add your thoughts around this as well. Async and 100% Slack is interesting. This is to Paul. This is from Ant, who works at Wise. He is asking you, do you find that people on the opposing time zone walk into a massive stream of threads when they log on? So I guess this was for Paul, but let's get you all answer this question, because you're all going to have the same or similar experiences. What do you think? Let's start with Paul first.
From my point of view, I think, it's inevitable that people do, in the time zone, in time zones later in the day, walk into a massive stream of threads when they log on. Actually, I think that's just the experience of working internationally. It's either Slack threads or it's email. Choose your poison, right? Actually, what that's just a problem with working in an international team. But then, you're going to leave a load of threads for them. They're going to wake up to those. They're going to leave a load of threads after you've finished. You're going to wake up to those, and the cycle kind of continues. And so I think that's inevitable. Whatever transit mechanism you use, ideally, what you want. And the thing that makes kind of international collaboration easier is some overlap between your time zones. The most difficult time zone differences of all to work across are those where you don't have any overlaps in your day. Because at least if you then do walk into threads, you can then pick up the conversation on those threads, put your kind of point across. You can have a conversation about them, and then Slack is dealt with as an asynchronous medium. And I think that's really important when you work internationally, to set out from the beginning, okay, we're going to use Slack, but just because the message is sent instantaneous does not mean that we expect a reply instantaneously. There are Slack is much better than when it initially started at respecting kind of downtime and stuff like that. And you can set kind of mute conditions and all of those kind of things. I would encourage everyone to do that, to be very clear that when you're not in the office, you're not at your Slack. And just like people, like I encourage people to turn off Slack when they're thinking. The last thing that you want when you're thinking is to be bombarded with a bunch of, or dragged into a conversation. That's as bad as tapping somebody who on the shoulder who's got their headphones on in an office, right? We all know that is verboten. And there are times when, sometimes you need to shut your Slack down and get some shit done. So that should be okay too. And so I think there are some guidelines that need to go around Slack to make it work internationally. But I don't think it's any better or worse necessarily than the situation you would have over email. Be interesting to hear what João sorry,
Inês.
I think too. Sorry.
No, don't worry. It's a long day. It's a Monday evening, you guys. I appreciate it.
Okay, a Monday evening. Yeah.
Yeah. So over to you guys.
We normally have the names underneath our screens, and with this technology that we're using, I think that we forgot to remember names. But this always happens, Paul. Don't worry about it. Not too fast. I think that with that one, that I would try to identify, like a good product manager, identify what is the cause of the problem, and what is why are people worried about that stream of information? Is it because they feel like they wish they'd known it before? Is it because they feel like missing out? Is it they feel like maybe Slack is not the best medium to be having those conversations? Like my personal favorite is copy pasting the conversation maybe into a Google Doc, and then everything is concentrated in that Google Doc, and then you can put it on Notion or somewhere else. Keep everything in the same place. So it's about, trying to pull that engine apart and understand where's the problem with the engine, where the issue comes from, but also what is the impact that issue is causing. So that's normally, that's where I would start.
Cool. And João?
Yeah, I fully agree with the massive stream phenomenon. And at Remote, we're fully global, and so I collaborate with people from the West Coast to Australia and New Zealand. So of course that happens, and it's not just when logging in. And at Remote, we also use Slack as our go-to internal tool. Like we don't email each other. We don't email colleagues ever. And so, of course, the massive stream is not just when logging on; it's all day. So that's the first thing. I do a really strict Slack diet. I can share maybe later. I even have on Twitter. I even showed publicly what's my Slack setup to really be able to have the important things and the critical things being surfaced, and the less important ones being more hidden within the Slack sidebar. Notifications, none ever. That's forbidden. And we also use Slack, but with the culture understanding that just because it's Slack, it doesn't mean that an instantaneous reply is expected. One thing that I thought initially, I do prefer and I try to start the day with something that I've already prepared. So having the first thing that I do when I start in the morning being lined up the day before and starting doing that before opening Slack or email. And initially, I thought that because I worked a lot with US folks who basically still have half a day in front of them when I log off in my evening, and so of course I may have queries and whatnot from them when I come back in the morning, and so I initially thought that I would have to forego that idea of not starting the day by checking Slack and email. But what I found is that if something can wait a whole night, it probably can wait another hour as well, because either it's something that had to be dealt with anyway, and already was, or if it's coming back, getting back to a colleague, and let's say from the US, they're not going to be away for a few hours, so it's not that hour that's going to change much. And the third thing is maybe you should be documenting more.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I remember when, years ago when we first started using Slack, it was just I was in this Slack rabbit hole and I couldn't, it was just such a distraction. So moving away from this perception that Slack is the thing that you need to be glued on and you almost, have there is an expectation that you respond. I think moving away from that is definitely a very important ground rule for you to do your work and not to be distracted with all the tools.
Yeah,
They're
I think it was
amazing.
Paul who mentioned that Slack also improved a lot through
Yeah.
time. For instance, threads also helped clean up a lot of the noise you get.
Yeah, and I've also, from my experience, I've noticed that there might be a question posted. By the time I look at it, there was a bunch of other people who already crowdsourced my answer, so I don't actually have to answer sometimes. And I'm like, cool, it's not a bad thing. Okay, great. Moving on, there is another question that we have from our audience. This was anonymous question, but there were few similar flavors of the same question. I will start with João because it touches on what you said in your presentation, but I would like to hear input from all of you. Is how do you motivate everyone in the team to keep the documentation up to date? That's that's the question. And then kind of part of it is then the second question is, anyone successfully done documentation without a wiki? We don't have a budget for Confluence or Notion, so I've been trying to in SharePoint or GDocs, but seems harder. So it's sort of twofold question, but it would be good to combine them and hear what you say about that.
Yeah, in terms of keeping documentation up to date, what I found is maybe in the descending or ascending order of difficulty. The first one is just using the documentation. And so, for instance, as I showed, the thing is that if you do use documentation as your answer to questions, and when someone asks something, someone just pointing them to documentation, then outdated documentation starts becoming more evident because they go there and it's like, yeah, I tried this, but it didn't work. Whereas if you just know that something changed and you answer how you do it now, then that old documentation will stay there forever. So using it. The other thing would be about making it more collaborative. So on the more or less in the vein that I mentioned of making the update process the path of least resistance. Anyone, and it's big. And what happens is that sometimes when the editing process is a bit more siloed, what happens is that there's no collective responsibility for documentation. It's like only that person can update that documentation. And so the other bit would be that even though specific people should be accountable for specific parts of the documentation, that everyone is responsible collectively, that as an organization that we can rely on documentation. And so if we find something outdated, then you should be empowered to go and update it right there and then. And of course, that not being too much of a burden for you if you make updating the path of least resistance. A bit harder asking for documentation. So it's the counterpart. And if it's not in the company's culture, it's harder, which is you ask something to someone and someone just says, oh yeah, this is how it is. And going, okay, cool, thank you. Do you have any documentation about this that I can rely on so that I don't have to ask again sometime? And so start pushing towards that. And last but not least, it's when it's putting documentation at the center of the company's culture, and a bit towards what Inês mentioned about kudos. If documentation is really an explicit part of the culture, then that's what people start being praised by, either informally or formally, even in performance reviews, and saying, okay, basically what are people rewarded by? And so if people are rewarded and praised by answering fast on Slack, and not rewarded or incentivized or praised by having solid documentation, well, yeah, you see what happens.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Very interesting.
As for the second, just going super quickly into the second question, yeah. I don't know if you want to go full round.
No, go first, and we'll
yeah.
we'll go on.
I actually never tried it. without something that would resemble typically a wiki. But I do feel that culture and behavior is really more important than the tool, and that you can pull it off with other tools. Because I also saw a lot of that behavior that I mentioned during the talk, that oh yeah, the wiki, have the people put stuff there, the other people don't go check before asking. Then the first half starts becoming frustrated and no longer updates the things, and then someone comes along and says, oh yeah, it's the wiki tool, that's the problem, we need to change from Confluence to Notion, that's the problem. And then one and a half later, the conversation is the same.
I love it. I love it when organizations always assume that technology is the solution to all the problems.
So yeah, again, I never tried without a tool that was in some way, shape, or form a wiki, like Confluence or Notion. But from experience, I saw wiki tool shifts that did nothing without culture and behavior changes.
Cool. How about your experience, Inês, around the same question? So, if you've got anything to add to how to motivate everyone in the team to keep the documentation up to date, if there is anything there.
No, it's tricky because it's and it depends on what motivates people. Sometimes you can try the carrot approach and say, if we need to, let's say it's something that you need to start from scratch, because sometimes it just happens. There's no documentation at all, and you start identifying, okay, this is a problem we need to fix. So you need to start from nothing. That is heavy. That can be very heavy. But then you can break that down, set up small goals, maybe help people with managing their calendar, because sometimes it might be too busy, rewarding them with the remote donuts. So depends on what makes people tick. But at the same time, and if you understand the team, maybe someone is really good at putting structure in place and someone else is good at filling the structure up. The first and the second wouldn't necessarily work together, because you would ask them to start top to bottom. And then the person who doesn't know how to put structure in place will never start anything because they don't have the structure. So, and the pair of people or tres amigos people around, you don't need to do it alone. Some people just need to have someone on the other side of the camera and be talking as they are writing down documentation. This happens, right? You might, it's about understanding what moves people. Tools wise, I've been in a lot of places where none of the jazzy tools were available. So Google Docs can be quite messy. But they are a good documentation tool, especially if you want to add layers of commentary around it, as long as someone's keeping an eye on it and cleaning it up, like cleaning it up, removing the comments that don't matter. But you need to tell the person before you remove their comment. But don't tell them that don't tell them it doesn't matter. Say it's very good conversation, very good comment. But that is resolved. I love the word resolved. Try, if the centralization of documentation is a problem, you can always try a Trello board, for example, and you can categorize each column and have the links to the folders and links to the documents in the one place, and that becomes your wiki, for example, as an idea.
Cool.
Always be adjusting.
Yeah, it is, using those principles, right, of sort of testing and refining and moving along. And how about you, Paul? Anything else to add to what we've already heard from João and Inês?
Great comments so far. The only thing I would say is if you're going to try and keep documentation up to date, don't use Miro. I've seen a large organization, everything on a Miro board. The Miro board takes ages to load. Nobody can find anything. You're zooming around for ages looking for stuff. Notion, Confluence, great. I'm sure it could work in SharePoint and GDocs. It definitely doesn't work in Miro.
Fair enough.
They do have a very handy search tool, though, I will say.
Yeah.
But it's not place for documentation. It's like searching something in Jira, right? You'll never find it.
Yeah, don't bother. Yeah.
I'm just gonna scan. Thank you very much, guys. I'm just looking at our questions. I'm appreciate that we are short on time, so I'm gonna end on one question being a bit of a devil's advocate, because we had a few specific questions around tools and ways of working, but and it's directed to all of you. Any downsides to working remotely? Ending on this positive note, because obviously we've been sort of singing praises and harnessing working remotely. I suppose, are there any downsides, and how, if anything? So over to you. Let's start with Inês this time.
I knew it. I was kind of feeling it.
Sorry, just trying to mix it up, so
Are there downsides for remote? Yes, if there's a time and a place for everything, right? At the same time as people are going back to the office, if the company where you're currently working at has defined that there's this one day that we all are together, if you are having meetings online, and if you're trying to put your headphones on and jot things down and try to answer to emails in the day where you're meant to be with people, those things are not going to align, right? So it's I normally try to narrow it down to there's a time and a place for everything. I will not say that remote is always good, because there's nothing is always good, but it's not always bad. I mean, the other day I had to do a facilitation session, and it took the whole afternoon. And it was in person. Everyone was in person, and I was freaking out the whole time. And I have a few years of experience, but I didn't have my templates. I had to write the notes down. People were talking over each other. I was like, what is this? I don't understand this. But it was, at the same time, I will say, it was incredibly useful, because that team had never been together. And as a team that are starting off from scratch, that was valuable for that. So that is my take on, is remote. There are downsides of remote. Like there's anything, there's always downsides, but it's like trying to make the most out of the situation and not trying to retrofit what you knew into this new context. Is different. It's not better, worse. It's a different context, and you need to adapt your work to the new context. End of reply.
Thank you. So I'm going to move around my screen. So Inês is at the top next to me. So I'm going to move down. Next on my screen is Paul. Paul, what do you think? What are your thoughts around that question?
I guess the downsides of working remotely, and certainly from our point of view as a kind of fully hybrid organization from the beginning, is probably how you have to work much harder to engineer serendipity. When you're in an office, when you inhabit the same space together, people will collide, ideas will collide, things will happen by accident. And I think when you're working remotely, even when you're working in a hybrid sense, because when you're working in a hybrid sense, there's fewer people in the office, and so there's fewer people to collide and ideas to collide, and so you have to create the conditions where those things happen. Besides, just trusting that the being present in the same space is going to make them happen. And so you have to be more conscious about them. You have to be more deliberate about them, and you just have to work that much harder to kind of create serendipitous moments where ideas can collide, where different people can meet. All of those kind of things. And I think that's the biggest downside for me of working remotely. That those things take that extra time. They don't happen by accident, like they do if you're in the same space. They happen because somebody made engineered the situation where they could happen.
Very interesting. Thank you. And João, what do you think?
I would point out something similar to what Paul pointed out about not being in the same space. Though I tend to shy away of the word serendipitous now, because I tend to find that what happens in the office is not serendipitous either. It might be spontaneous, but it happens because someone said that those people needed to be there. And so, but I fully agree that you need to then be deliberate. What I would focus on is, instead of just the work bit and the collaboration and innovation and exchange of knowledge, it's something that I think Inês also touched upon briefly towards the end of her presentation about struggles. And it's not just the being in the same physical space or not, but also when you start having a culture of towards documentation first, towards the synchronicity, etc., you start having to have less and less moments to see, or conversely to share, that you're struggling, either personally or professionally. And so you need to be, and then both things, you need to be more deliberate and more explicit in finding out, and also in sharing when you're struggling, when you need help, either personally because you're going through something in your life, or just because you're struggling with a part of your work, of your job. So you can't. You have less moments, especially if you cut meetings for efficiency's sake. You have less moments to see / show that someone is frustrated, is just bored, etc., etc. And so you need to really push and ask and tell and be deliberate and explicit about how you're feeling.
Awesome. That is, I mean, we could stay here all night, but I guess we all have other things to do. It's Monday night, so really appreciate that everyone joined us tonight, and obviously great round of applause to our speakers joining us here on our virtual stage. Thank you very much. I've seen in the comments that some of you wanted to get the slides. I will mail the slides using the Meetup group, and I'll just send them across. I guess I'm going to grab them off our lovely speakers first, so you'll hear from me tomorrow morning. Thank you very much for this amazing evening. Yeah. I guess I'm just going to clap sort of virtually.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming and joining us on this stage. And yeah, see you all hopefully in Conway Hall if you can. We are going to do our first face-to-face event in March. So hope to see you all very soon in person. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Good evening.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.